The Voice of Russia World Service welcomes you to another edition of the Christian Message from Moscow. Today we bring you a radio version of the documentary story by Orthodox writer Nikolai Kokuhin.
I had been acquainted with Marina for quite some time, yet had never visited her at home. Several days ago I ran across her in church, and she told me she was spending the entire summer at a rehabilitation center in Kratovo, just outside Moscow, together with her husband and ill teenage son.
It's such a lovely spot. Do come and get some fresh air,
she urged me. I was so exhausted by Moscow's hypertense atmosphere that I accepted the offer. When I arrived at Marina's, she was out. The first ones I saw were her husband Anatoly and son Artyom. Anatoly, a thick-set, sunburnt man, rolled the wheelchair from the porch down some sloping boards and came to a stop. Sitting in the chair was Artyom. He had closely cropped hair. His head and entire body leaned to the left. With his right hand he held on to the armrest, as if afraid of falling. His left arm was much thinner than the right. Approaching me, Anatoly said,
"Marina will be here in a moment. She's gone to do some shopping."
Soon Marina drove up. After parking the car, she got out and came towards me. Light-haired, of medium height, with big, dark, slightly tired-looking eyes.
I never thought I'd be driving a car. I've neither the driving skills nor a desire to drive. But I was obliged to, because of Artyom. Who else would drive him to the hospitals? There's nobody but me.
And your husband?
He has poor eyesight. In a word, I had to go and get driving lessons.
We picked up the food parcels and went into the house. It was a two-story building intended for 4 owners. Marina's flat was on the first floor. 3 separate rooms with spacious windows and comfortable furniture, a kitchen, veranda, bathroom and toilet. I couldn't help exclaiming, it's really lovely here."
Yes, and what air! The pines, firs and birches. There's nowhere like it. A lovely pond, a beach, boats. Heaven. These are houses for handicapped children. The pay here is quite reasonable. Half of the expense is covered by the Invalid Fund, while we provide the rest.
we went outside again. It was a warm, sunny day with birds singing and a pleasant apple shade from the tall pines and fir trees on the luxuriant grass. For us, city dwellers, it was a welcome retreat amidst bountiful nature. Marina wheeled Artyom towards a well-wrought oak table, and we all seated ourselves around it. The conversation turned to what happened to Artyom several years ago. Artyom was 11 at the time. One Sunday morning he set off for the swimming pool. Upon seeing the bus he needed approaching the bus stop, he made a run for it, failing to notice the car that had darted out on his left. The car ran the boy over. The windscreen rail dealt him a severe blow on the head. His body suffered no injuries.
What followed were hospitals, reanimation. For 4 weeks the boy was suspended between life and death. They didn't believe he would survive. And then we made the rounds of various hospitals. I was with him all the time. For several months we lived under a great deal of strain. We kept waiting for some signs of an improvement, but none were forthcoming.
Marina grew silent, lowering her eyes. Then she cast her glance to the pond, across which a boat with passengers was gliding.
I don't know how we came through it all.
We fought for him every day and every hour. We consulted so many doctors, showed him to the best specialists, afraid of missing something.
While speaking, Anatoly kept rubbing his hands as if they were freezing. It was obvious he was trying hard to contain his emotions.
When we returned from the hospitals, Artyom said, no, he didn't actually say it. Those were not words, but a semblance of words, which I would have understood even without the sounds. He said, "Mother, I am dead." I burst out crying, and afterwards I said, "Son, my darling, you aren't dead. You're alive, thanks be to God." I embraced him and whispered in his ear, "The Lord loves you and needs you the way you are."
He is weak and infirm, that's true, thought I about Artyom. Yet he has a tremendous advantage over us, healthy ones. He is incapable of sin.
This is our 4th time in Kratovo. Such a wonderful respite.
Does Artyom like it here?
Of course. It's one thing being in the city, locked in its asphalt jungle, and quite another out here, in the lap of nature. There are 6 of us resting here, myself with my husband and Artyom, and my daughter Nadia with 2 children.
Where are they, incidentally? I haven't yet seen them.
Nadia's making lunch, and the children are with her. The Lord has arranged for our salvation by looking after Artyom, my husband, daughter, grandchildren and I on the road to salvation.
Your friend Ksenia has been granted a good opportunity through this too.
That's for sure. Ksenia studies at a pedagogical institute, the Department of Psychology, and every year she has practical studies. So I tell her, work with Artyom. What better practice could you get? She agreed. All summer she worked with him, talking, giving him various tasks, watching his reaction to colours, scents and new people. She wrote an account afterwards that turned out to be so interesting, profound and psychologically true that the people in her institute eagerly read it.
How many years have passed since...
It's 8 already. For my husband and me, they are equal to 80, I think.
Is Artyom's condition stable?
No, it's good one day and the next back to reanimation. There are new problems emerging all the time that only experts can tackle, and one doesn't always come across experienced specialists. You know, one day I took Artyom to a research and development institute to try and treat Artyom's nervous breakdown, and the doctor, while examining him, began making passes over his head with his hands and then said, "He's suffering from such and such a syndrome and such pathology." And then a different doctor comes in and also starts waving his hands above my son's head, saying, "He has such and such pathology and such a syndrome." Enough, I told them. Off I go to the head physician and say, "What on earth is happening here? Have you got psychics working?" And the head doctor, a woman, says, "We make use of the most up-to-date scientific knowledge. I personally had a trainee session in the USA." And I'd hurried home, away from all that devilry. God forbid that any of them treat my Artyom. I'm sure if they got their clutches into him, he wouldn't have got out of there alive.
Nadezhda appeared on the porch, a sweet-looking woman in a light-colored sports suit. "Lunchtime," she announced, approaching us and putting a tray on the table. Anatoly wheeled Artyom closer to the table, put an apron around him, and after testing the soup to see it was not too hot, began feeding his son. The youth opened his mouth wide, swallowing mouthful after mouthful. The next course was cauliflower and buckwheat. Artyom chewed slowly and swallowed with difficulty, as if the food brought him no pleasure. He ate simply because he was being fed, and he couldn't refuse. He drank the compote through a straw quite quickly. Anatoly held the glass. Then he said,
Drinking was a big problem initially. Artyom couldn't manage it at first, but learned to later.
After the feeding was over, Anatoly wiped Artyom's mouth, got him seated more comfortably, and wheeled the chair away from the table. "Marina, is the church far from here?"
Thank God, no. Quite near. I drive Artyom there in the car. My husband helps. My daughter and her children walk on foot.
Does Artyom sense the arrival of Sunday?
Yes. By some second sense, he singles out that day. I haven't yet said anything to him, yet there he is already preparing for our trip to church.
Approaching the wheelchair, I crouched down to better see the youth's face. "Artyom, we pray for you. When you are in the heavens, you pray for us too. We shall be in great need of your prayers." The youth looked at me. His brown eyes were full of ineffable sorrow. This was no earthly or sinful sorrow. It was a sorrow full of longing for the heavens. Earthly life was so obviously burdensome for him. When I was rising, Artyom made a motion with his right hand, as if in acknowledgement. He understood me. Of course he did. A joyous feeling washed over me, warming my heart. The shadows from the firs and pines had noticeably moved to the right, towards the house. The very air seemed to be in slumber, and the birch leaves were motionless. The shouts of bathers echoed from the pond. Artyom said several words that only his parents could understand.
Right, son. Let's go.
Anatoly directed the wheelchair to the house. With a having motion, he rolled it up the porch. Marina's glance followed her son and husband. She said,
My son is tired. The bright sun, greenery, sounds and smells of summer are at times too much for him. It's quieter in the house.
And in the evening?
It's better in the evening. When the sun goes down, the sounds and scents weaken and the birds settle. At dusk, we take a turn around the pond, along the asphalt path. My daughter, grandchildren, my husband and I, and Artyom in front. He leads us.
We stood there in silence.
Artyom has changed our lives. My husband had not been christened, with all due consequences. He paid very little attention to the children. After what happened to Artyom, he was christened, began going to church occasionally, and now knows Our Father by heart. Although I had been christened, yet in actual fact I was just as godless as he. I lived an irresponsible life. Artyom really shook our life to the very foundation. We finally saw the light. Gradually, we were able to embrace the faith. In a word, the Lord revived 2 corpses. I never stopped thanking him for his clemency and vision.
We strolled in the woods and afterwards entered the house. I couldn't help looking into Artyom's room. He lay on the bed, the palm of his hand tucked under his cheek, covered with a light blanket. His face bore a tranquil expression, as if he were already in heaven, conversing with the angels.
You are listening to a radio version of a narrative by Orthodox writer Nikolai Kokuhin, read by Pavel Novichkov, Carl Watts, and Svetlana Yakimenko. This documentary story is a perfect occasion to dwell on the purpose and benefit of sufferings that the Lord sends Christians for their salvation. And there we end another program in the series Christian Message from Moscow. It was produced by Vladimir Dyomin, text and music editor Tatiana Shvetsova, sound engineer Svetlana Afanasieva.
Join us same time next week. Goodbye and God save you all.